Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's virtual event, Resistance Until Return, addressing the root causes within a rights-based decolonization approach. This event is hosted by the Canadian BDS Coalition and international BDS allies, and is the final in a series of events that have been held this week, the week of International Week of Action Resisting Genocide, Boycotting for Palestinian Liberation. I'm Karen Rodman from Just Peace Advocates. Just Peace Advocates is a Canadian-based organization, and we are a member of the Canadian BDS Coalition and international BDS allies. Today, we have an engaging panel of Palestinians with lived experience in resisting until return. Lubna, Haider, Hannah, and Khaled, welcome. We also welcome, you're welcome. Also, we welcome those who are attending. We have people from across the globe and from many parts of across Canada as well. We are live streaming as well as recording today's event. Those who have registered will receive a recording of today's event at any of the links that we provide. Also, those links and information will be shared with our social media and in other forums. Please, for the participants, as you have questions, do put them into the question and answer option, and we will be getting to as many of those as we can after the panelists each have spoken. So to get started, Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons today make up more than 9 million people and account for 2/3 of the Palestinian people, these people being denied the right of return. This right of return has been denied for 76 years, but also has continued through multiple forced displacements, including through this past year of genocide. It is in this context that our speakers today will speak to resistance until return is realized. Our first speaker is Lubna Shamali. Lubna is the Manager of Administration and Financial Affairs and Advocacy at the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. Established in 1998, Badil's work includes legal and international advocacy, research and documentation, and community mobilization. Lubna joins us from Beit Sahur. Welcome, Lubna.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here, and I would like to express my appreciation to the BDS Coalition and allies, the participating organizations, my fellow panelists, of course, and all those who put in the effort and time to make this webinar happen. I would also like to take this opportunity to recognize, thank, and honor the resistance and sumud of our people in Gaza, especially those in northern Gaza, and the Lebanese people as well. I'm going to try to stick to the time that I have been allotted, but when I started putting this together, I realized that there was a lot to say. So bear with me. In any discussion on Palestine, it is important to understand and recognize the root causes. If the root causes are correctly identified, then we can put forth solutions that address and resolve these root causes. So for over a century, the Palestinian people have been denied their inalienable right to self-determination. And a crucial and significant part of this is also the denial of their right of return. This has been done using ongoing forced displacement and transfer, colonization, and apartheid. These are three interlinked and overlapping pillars that make up the Israeli regime of domination over the Palestinian people and Mandatory Palestine. These are the root causes, the imposition of a system of domination that seeks the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, their replacement with a foreign population, and the imposition of institutionalized discrimination policies and practices to control the people, the land, and its resources. And this colonial apartheid regime is implemented over all of Mandatory Palestine, not just the territory colonized in 1967. And it is applied to all of the Palestinian people, regardless of their legal status or the place in which they currently reside today. The violation or the denial of self-determination is a crime and prohibited under international law. So systems of oppression, like colonization and apartheid, are also crimes and prohibited under international law because they deny the right of self-determination. And so, since we are dealing with a colonial apartheid regime, international law dictates that apartheid is first completely dismantled, and then we can implement a rigorous rights-based decolonization approach. Dismantling apartheid and decolonization means the fulfillment of the rights of the people who experience the oppression and domination, meaning that an intrinsic part of the decolonization process must be the implementation of the rights of self-determination of the Palestinian people and the right of return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. Because of the ongoing displacement and transfer, when we refer to the Palestinian people as a national group, we talk about a people who 66% of their population are Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, as Karen has just said. 66%, that means 2/3 and counting, of course. Because if we look at the current situation, we see not only a genocide where the Israeli regime, with the participation and complicity of colonial states, are attempting to physically destroy a part of our people, but we also see the intensification and the escalation of forced displacement and transfer, colonization, and suppression policies across all of Mandatory Palestine, and of course, the aggression into Lebanon. To fully realize the right of self-determination, an intrinsic and non-negotiable part of exercising that right is the exercise of the right of return. Exercising the right of self-determination for only a part of the Palestinian people. So, for example, only those residing in the territory colonized in 1967, and foregoing the right of return of Palestinian refugees from 1948 residing in the 1967 territory, or those in exile, or those internally displaced in 1948 Palestine, is only a partial exercise of that right and would not fulfill the essence and principle of the right of self-determination. And also it would not achieve justice for the Palestinian people. And so to practically, justly and sustainably exercise return and self-determination, the Israeli colonial apartheid regime must be dismantled. And this is a regime that is prohibited under international law. So this means that the policies and practices that were put in place, which caused the international crimes of forced displacement and transfer, colonization, and apartheid to occur in the first place, and that have been in place since at least 1948, they must be eliminated. Then the question is, how do we dismantle the Israeli colonial apartheid regime? Or more accurately, how is it that to this day, the atrocities and crimes committed by the Israeli regime have been allowed not only to continue, but to escalate? The Israeli regime would not be able to implement, sustain, and expand its colonial apartheid regime in Palestine and the Arab region without the support and complicity of its colonial allies. So colonial Western states have not only stood on the sidelines of our ongoing Nakba, but have provided the Israeli regime with the political, economic, and military resources it needs to establish, maintain, and expand its oppression and domination. So here we can talk about the Balfour Declaration, the UN Partition Plan of 1947, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, the Oslo Accords, the Deal of the Century, the never-ending peace process, the US vetoes in the United Nations General Assembly, and dozens of other examples how powerful colonial states have taken an active role in denying the right of self-determination and return of the Palestinian people by supporting the Israeli colonial apartheid regime. These measures and instruments, as well as many others, have been used by the Israeli regime and its colonial allies in an attempt to legitimize Israel's illegal presence and domination in Palestine and impose, under the false promises of a two-state solution and the peace process, their colonial aspirations for the region. These colonial states have had an enormous influence over how the Palestinian question has been managed over the last century. And their influence is quite obvious when we look at the recent ICJ advisory opinion of July of 2024 and the UNGA resolution of September 2024. Both the advisory opinion and the resolution are heavily influenced by the international community's prevalent conflict management paradigm and decontextualization approach. This approach, of course, ignores the root causes, advances a balanced framework where the parties of the conflict are on equal footing, and it does not recognize a situation of oppressor and oppressed, colonizer and colonized. The conflict resolution paradigm seeks to manage rather than provide just and durable solutions grounded in international law, principles, and standards. The decontextualization of the legal, historical, and political context based on the use of the highly restrictive 1967 framework has led the promotion of this management approach to dangerously place restrictions on the fulfillment of the rights of self-determination and return to the entirety of the Palestinian people. Now, while the advisory opinion did contain a stronger legal analysis of Israel's policies and practices that the court did rule to be illegal, the advisory opinion stopped just short of making a clear and irrefutable ruling that Israeli policies and practices constitute colonization and apartheid. And of course, this ruling was limited in geographic scope to only the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So it omitted, of course, occupied West Jerusalem, the territory colonized in 1948, and of course, Gaza. Both the advisory opinion and the UNGA resolution failed to make the fundamental and irrefutable link between Israel's policies and practices prior to 1967. Both completely ignore the Nakba of 1948, the period leading up to the occupation of 1967. In both of these documents, there is not a single mention of the Palestinian refugee issue, their right of return, or how the right of self-determination cannot be fully realized without the right of return, nor the right to resist. The ICJ advisory opinion and the UNGA resolution use the same watered-down, weak language stemming from a decontextualized and limited approach, which resulted in the absence of strong recommendations and practical measures for states to implement in order to hold the Israeli regime accountable. Meaning there is no clear recommendation in the advisory opinion, nor a clear measure in the UNGA resolution for arms embargoes and sanctions against Israel. So in the end, we have to ask ourselves, how do we create a situation in which states have no choice but to adhere to their obligations under international law, to impose arms embargoes and sanctions against the Israeli regime? And the answer, of course, is through resistance and solidarity. Colonial states have not only engaged in facilitating the perpetuation of Israel's colonial apartheid regime, but they have also taken measures to criminalize Palestinian resistance and the solidarity of international civil society with the Palestinian struggle for liberation. It should be noted that the national struggle of a people for liberation from colonial domination and oppression, from an entity that denies their right of self-determination in return, is achieved with armed and non-armed resistance. And this resistance is recognized and sanctioned by international law. Not only is armed and non-armed resistance recognized as a path to liberation, but the international community is also obligated to support this resistance, meaning that international solidarity with the Palestinian people is both a moral and legal imperative and must serve the fulfillment of their inalienable rights to self-determination in return. True solidarity then means supporting the struggle for Palestinian liberation and challenging the demonization of acts of solidarity with the Palestinian people. This includes, of course, falsely equating criticism of the Israeli regime and solidarity with Palestine as anti-Semitism, and the delegitimization and criminalization of all forms of Palestinian resistance and the demonization of the Palestinian people. Now, it should be said that the international solidarity movement has been phenomenal. They have been with us since the very beginning of the genocide and even from before, with hundreds of thousands of direct actions that have been designed to create pressure on states to fulfill their obligations. Now, since we're kind of at a standstill and states still refuse to fulfill their obligations, this means that we need an escalation of direct actions that disrupt the status quo and create material costs. So in essence, we have a responsibility, both with our resistance and the solidarity of the international community, to force states to fulfill their obligations to hold Israel accountable for its international crimes by getting them to implement arms embargoes and sanctions. So I'll stop there and answer any questions that may be directed my way later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lubna. What a large amount of decades of history to cover and to provide the context for us to move forward with our other three speakers. I will remind people to drop any questions you have into the Q&A as well. So thank you so much, Lubna. And our next speaker is Haider Abdigush. As a youth, Haider was expelled by the Israeli military in 1967 from his home in Inwas. Haider's village is one of three that Canada Park was built over. I first got to know Haider in 2016 when he toured across Canada as part of the efforts to expose the Jewish National Fund's erasure of Palestine. Canada Revenue Agency recently revoked the Jewish National Fund of Canada's charitable status. Haider joins us today from Jerusalem. Welcome, Haider.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to everybody. Actually, I will start that my story is not different to a certain extent from destroying more than 530 Palestinian villages by Israel since 1948. But the unique thing in my village, together with two villages, Yalu and Vetnuba, they were not destroyed in 1948. They were destroyed after the 67 war and the occupation of the West Bank after this war. There was nothing about battles or fights in our area when the Israeli army occupied our village. but it seems that they had already planned to expel all the people in these three villages, demolish them, and actually for nothing, because what's in there that over MOS and in our area, they did not do anything except that they declared this area as a military closed area. And after a few years, early 70s, I think in 1972, there was a fundraiser, big fundraiser in Canada to collect money, millions, to build what is called now the Canada Park. Canada Park is one of the recreation, if I can use this word, recreation areas used to cover up the demolished villages in Palestine. About 68 national parks inside Israel are used just to cover up the crimes of demolishing these villages. Our in the West Bank, this was the only one, and this was the one that they started in 1960, in the 70s, after demolishing it in 1967. Actually, we moved to live in Ramallah, then we moved to different places, but I find myself lucky that I could speak about this in Canada, and thanks to the Jewish Voices for Peace and other organizations who organized my trip across Canada from the ocean to the ocean to talk about what happened. And I'm really happy that after about 8 years, that our Canadian friends succeeded in deleting the name of charity on the Jewish the Jewish National Fund, which has nothing to do with charity. The Jewish National Fund is an organization that is used from early of the mandatory time to steal the land of the Palestinians inside Palestine, and they actually established about 46 of these 68 national parks inside Israel to cover up the demolished villages, the demolished Palestinian villages. It was really great to hear that you succeeded, Karen. And the issue of the expelling Palestinians from their villages and towns and building either building other sites instead of them, or renaming the places or whatever. It's part of the Zionist project over Palestine to have a land without its original inhabitants. And for them, I think they didn't succeed in having this, because now in the West Bank and in Gaza and inside Israel and East Jerusalem, there are about more than 60 million Palestinians living in this area, despite the expelling and making the life tougher and tougher for our people to live. But still, we continue, and we have no other place to go to, actually. This is our land, and true that we moved from our village to another place, but still it is Palestine, and we have no other country to live in outside this place. So the idea of having I remember when I was in Canada and in all my talks, I used to finish my talk with some words that there is no security without peace, and there is no peace without justice. And I think this applies also to the time that we are seeing here and we are experiencing and we are suffering from. Thank you again, Karen, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much, Haider, and we really appreciate and remember your work traveling across Canada in 2016, and certainly it was through those years that CRA was actually conducting the audit of the Jewish National Fund. It takes about 10 years or so for these revocations to happen, so I'm not sure that any of us, in fact, none of us can really claim that we had anything to do with it, but perhaps all of us played a role in bringing that to Canada Revenues Agency's attention. Our next speaker is Hannah Kawaz. Hannah is the chairperson of the Canada-Palestine Association. Hannah has been organizing in Canada since the mid-1970s. He, with his partner, Marian, began the weekly Voice of Palestine in 1987, I believe it was, Hannah, and co-hosted that show over the decades. Hannah's family was twice displaced, first in the Nakba in 1948, and again in 1967. Hannah has been very much a mentor to me, and I'm very thankful to be able to work in solidarity with Hannah through the Canadian BDS Coalition and international BDS allies. Hannah joins us today from Vancouver. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to everyone on the panel and who was watching us on Zoom. I think I'd like to emphasize what Lubna said, that the root cause of the problem is the settler colonialist movement that's called Zionism. Because, you know, for them to settle in Palestine, they had to uproot the indigenous people of Palestine. And this is exactly what happened. So it's, you know, the supremacist mentality of this ideology allows it to do anything and everything, from committing war crimes to genocide to apartheid. And this is supported by the West in general, and in specific by the US, and Canada has played a major role in establishing this Zionist state in Palestine. Having said that, the right of return was adopted at the United Nations in December 11, 1949, where it's said that Palestinians has a right to return to their homeland. This resolution never been implemented till now. Not just that, the Zionist leaders publicly stated that they won't accept Palestinians to return to their homeland. In a meeting, cabinet meeting in June 1948, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion stated, and I quote, "They," meaning the Palestinians, "lost and fled. Their return must now be prevented. Their return must now be prevented." That's Ben-Gurion. In 1992, Yitzhak Shamir declared that the return of the Palestinian refugees, quote, "will never happen in any way, shape, or form. There is only a Jewish right of return to the land of Israel," end of quote. That was Yitzhak Shamir, another prime minister. 5 months after passing the right of return resolution 194, Israel in May 11th, exactly 5 months to the date, May 11th, Israel was accepted to the United Nations by a resolution 273. 273 basically is a fraud resolution on two levels. First, it stated that Israel is a peace-loving state. After all the crimes and the genocide they committed in 47, 48, the United Nations decides that Israel is a peace-loving state. You know, this is one fraud. The other fraud, they stated that Israel promised that it would honor its obligation under Resolution 181 and Resolution 194. Resolution 181 is the partition plan where Israel took a quarter of Palestine in addition to what's allotted to it in Resolution 181, from 56% given to the so-called Jewish state. They occupied 78% of the land. And, you know, there, the Abba Iban was the representative at the United Nations then in 1949, and he promised that Israel will honor its obligation under these two resolutions, the right of return and the partition plan. You know, it's a fraud because, I mean, if you want to accept a state, you first ask it to implement this resolution, not on a promise, on a fraud promise from the settler colonialist entity that was established, and not, as Haider said, it demolished in 1948 over 500 towns and villages in Palestine. They wiped them out of the map of the earth. Also, they ethnically cleansed 2/3 of the Palestinian population. And the United Nations decided that Israel is a peace-loving state. I mean, what a joke, what a fraud. So these two things, you know, I mean, if you want to really follow the letter of the resolution of 273, Israel shouldn't be a member organization because they didn't implement what they promised to implement in during the debate about this resolution 273. Again, this is not new to Israel. They lie and they fabricate things. It's not the only fabrication they stated about Palestine and the Palestinians, from denying even the existence of Palestinians to saying that Palestine was a land without people. All these lies, I mean, now all these lies don't pass anymore on the people of the world. So in 67, when they occupied the rest of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, we, again, as Karen stated, we were basically forced to leave our hometown, Bethlehem, for the squeeze they put on the people of Palestine. I just would like to remind, there is an article in the magazine 972 where the the title of it says, "The Israeli academics who helped design Palestinian immigration." They actually formed a professors' committee that, following the occupation, devised policies to pacify the Palestinians and make them leave the West Bank. I'll put a link if people are interested on the chat to see that it is systematic what Israel was doing. They wanted really to empty the land and have a supremacist Jewish majority in Palestine. I just put the link to that study. So it's clear, you know, again, I would say genocide haven't started in October 7. Genocide started in 1948, 47, 48, where they committed atrocities and massacres that was unheard of. And they weren't reported because we didn't have the news media that we have nowadays, the social media and other alternative medias. You know, Canada played a major role in our dispossession, and you know, people, especially on the issue of the refugees, I'll just, you know, instead of talking, taking lots of time talking about them, I'm gonna post some of the links that are posted on our website so people see the Canadian position from the refugees, from the Palestinian refugees, from the resolutions that pass every year on the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian cause. 20 resolution every year is passed. And Canada recently, the last 10, 15 years, they've been opposing most of these resolutions, including the resolution that states that Palestinians has a right to return, and especially the person displaced after 67. They oppose this resolution, although hypocritically they state in their policy paper that you know, the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and Jerusalem as an occupied territory. So if you really consider it occupied territory, why you oppose people who've been forced out, whether economically or through military conquest? Why don't allow them to return if you consider it occupied territories? It shows the hypocrisy and the double standard of the Canadian government. You know, just I'll post some of these links for people on the thing when I finish, but I'd like to conclude that, you know, we are not fighting Israel. We are fighting the US superpower. And the same, this is not new. This has been from day one, from the acceptance of Resolution 181. The US twisted arms of 3 countries to change their vote to pass the Resolution 181. If I recall, it was Philippines, the Ivory Coast, and some Latin American countries. So it's clearly, since then, we've been fighting US and British imperialism in the Middle East. We fought British imperialism when they conquered Palestine and colonized Palestine, but also after the collapse of the so-called empire of the British Empire, the US took that role. Gaza operation, Israeli operation, exposed all this facade and showed that without the US, Israel can continue with its genocide and with its occupation of Palestine and denying the Palestinian people their self-determination. Canada is playing a role, you know. Also, it's clear what Canada stands for. They're still sending arms to Israel in spite of the genocide that's taking place. They not just send genocide, they send special forces after October 7 to help Israel, you know, locate, you know, the prisoners that the resistance movement took during October 7th, and they didn't deny that they are there, the special forces, although they claim they are there not for that. But who believes this nonsense? They said that they are there to protect the Canadian embassy. You know, I mean, what a joke. I mean, you don't send special forces just to protect this the embassy. They are cooperating with Israeli on all levels, military level, intelligence level, and economic level. And it's about time that we stand up for all these foreign forces and, you know, the countries in the West in general, because their destiny, as I said many times, is to the dustbin of history, the same as Zionism and the Israeli state. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Because people are having questions in the question and answer, the panelists are answering some of those live. So I remind people they can actually check under the question and answer for some of the answers to questions that have been asked. And also remind people that you can put your questions into the Q&A as well. We will be providing these links when we send out the recording to those who have registered. So both those who are here with us today and those who registered but didn't join live, aren't joining live, we will get all of those links out to you as well. Now our final speaker is Khalid Mamour. Khalid is a Christian Palestinian Canadian who was forced to flee from his hometown, Nazareth, in 1948. He is one of the founders of the Canadian Arab Federation back in 1967 and has served as its president, I think, several times over the years. Khalid is also a former member of the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. I've had the pleasure of learning and working in solidarity with Khalid on many projects over the last few years, be it on some of the charity work that we've already spoken about, or illegal Israeli military recruiting and other projects. We welcome Khalid. Khalid.
Thank you, Karen, for your commitment to justice, which has been unbelievable. And I'm glad to meet Lubna and Haidar and my old friend Hannah from many years ago. I would like to start by acknowledging that the city of Richmond Hill, on which I reside, is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit River, of the Credit First Nation and the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, and is part of the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. As an indigenous Palestinian Semite, whose people have been denied the right to self-determination for more than 100 years, I would like to take this opportunity to commit myself to the struggle against the systems of oppression that have dispossessed our indigenous peoples in Canada of their lands and denied them the rights to self-determination for 500 years. And this explains why Canada has been outrageous in its support of this new settler colonial entity, which was implanted by the British in Palestine since 1917. My family originates from Nazareth, and they've lived there for centuries. However, in 1946, me and my elder brother were sent to Haifa to a private school to study, and we were looked after by my grandmother, who's from Haifa. And that's when the Zionist plan was getting ready to implement its target of expelling the Palestinians. So in late 1947, the Haganah started its campaign in Haifa to force as many Palestinian Arabs to leave. At that time, the population in Haifa had 70,000 Arabs. By the end of 1948, only 2,000 had remained. Most 68,000 were either injured, killed, or forced to flee to neighboring towns or to neighboring countries. And in our case, we had to take a taxi to the border with Lebanon, and the Lebanese border were closed, contrary to what the Zionists have always promoted, that it was the Arab countries that told the Palestinian refugees come, and that's why we left. The borders were closed, so we had to find a farmer who had donkeys, who took us up the mountains, crossed illegally into Lebanon, and that's how we ended up in Lebanon. The Lebanese state didn't want the refugees to leave their country. And we thought we would spend a few months there with my grandmother's sister, who was married to a Lebanese. But after more than 6 months, after the declaration of the State of Israel and the realization that they were not going to implement the Resolution 194 calling for the return of the refugees, we moved into a village in Lebanon, Brummana, and that's where we stayed. Now, however, when we go back to Nazareth, I would like to give you a summary of the population of Nazareth in 1948. Nazareth had 12,000 people only. After the massacres and the expulsion that Israel undertook in between 1947 and the end of 1948, the population grew to 48,000. That tells you that 1/4 of the population of Nazareth are really the original citizens. Nazareth now has 80,000 people. 60,000 of them are internally displaced Palestinians who were displaced when the State of Israel was created. They came from the villages of Safuria, which was 5 kilometers away. And there's a neighborhood in Nazareth called the Safuria neighborhood, where about 20,000 of the descendants of the Safuri people live. And they live in this neighborhood, which overlooks Safuria, by the way, because Nazareth is at a height of 400 meters and Safuria is down on a plain. So they can always see the lands of their village, which had been destroyed, and now there's a national park there, as Haider said, and they cannot go there. But they tell their children, we are originally from there. And the other villages around Nazareth, which were destroyed, which sought, safety in Nazareth, were from Mjaidel, Ma'lul, and Andor. Andor is an old historic village, from the Canaanite times. Ma'lul, we went to Ma'lul, by the way, in 2022, because my daughter Layla, who was born in Canada, she ended up finally marrying a Palestinian Arab from Israel and now lives in Nazareth. And she told me, Dad, they expelled you, but we are back. Now, Ma'lul, when we saw Ma'lul, this was a village. Most of this population sought refuge in Nazareth. The only thing standing is our two churches, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. The mosque was really demolished because it was used by the Israelis for their horses and cows and all of that. So it's nearly demolished. And the village is completely destroyed, but the churches are still uh, there, and the people of Ma'lul, who are originally from Ma'lul, come there every year to celebrate Christmas, or if they have a marriage or a death in the family. Now, the Muslim cemetery was completely obliterated. The Christian cemetery is in the military zone, and the Christians, descendants from Ma'lul, cannot visit their grandparents. But one member of a descendant went to the courts in Israel and was able to get the court to pass a decision that she can visit the grave of her grandfather. But that's an exception. An exception was made for her because she went to the court. The rest could not visit these cemeteries. So this is what we're dealing with. A Zionist movement which aims, a settler colonial movement like Canada, whose aim is to erase the history, the culture, and the existence of the people, the indigenous people of the land. And they have not been successful because, as I said, my daughter went back and now she has 3 children living in Nazareth. And she's very optimistic. She says the future is ours. This is a country which lives on foreign support. And if you know who are the foreign supporters, it started with the British who implanted the Zionism and the State of Israel, and it was followed up by the United States. And its major supporters are really colonial imperial powers like Germany, France, and England. Germany had Namibia, it was dismantled. Britain had Rhodesia and South Africa, and they were dismantled. And France had Algeria, and that was dismantled. And I am confident, most Palestinians are confident that the same fate will meet this racist, supremacist, settler colonial entity, which claims to represent Jews. And by doing this, they are really the main promoter of anti-Jewish racism, because Jews are not guilty of apartheid and genocide, which is being committed by this racist supremacist state. However, the saddest and most outrageous part is that I came to Canada, which after I came to Canada as an immigrant in 65, I dealt a little research. Canada, until 1967, by the way, had racist rules. It did not accept people from non-white European countries. Very few were accepted from non-white European countries. And I remember that because when I applied for immigration, and I was in Brazil at that time, I went to the Canadian embassy in Sao Paulo, and he was asking me, "Where was your father born?" I said, in Nazareth. "Your mother?" I said, "In Khartoum, Sudan." He said, "Sudan? Is she Sudanese?" I said, "No, she's Syrian, but her father was working in Sudan." So really, at that time, in 65, if my mother was really a Sudanese, I wouldn't have been accepted to Canada. That is the reality. And this was changed in 1967, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was issued later on to say, Canadians, regardless of their religious, ethnic, national, gender, or political opinion, have equal rights and fundamental freedoms. But in practice, our governments, our institutions violate this every day. And this is why they still have refused, the Canadian government and Canadian politicians and the mainstream media refuse to admit that Israel is an apartheid state, even though B'Tselem in 2021 said between the river and the sea, there's an apartheid system. Human Rights Watch came in early 2022 saying the same thing, apartheid. Amnesty International followed, said this is apartheid. However, Canadian politicians, institutions so far refuse to admit and recognize this reality. Next, Canada says, we support international law, we support the Fourth Geneva Convention, and yet in practice, they are violating it all the time. Canada has the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement with Israel, which allows goods from the 300 colonies in the West Bank and East Jerusalem to enter Canada tariff-free in violation of Canadian law. Canada allows charities to send money to the Israeli army and to the settlements, even though it's in violation of the Income Tax Law Act. Canada allows Canadians to serve in the Israeli military, which is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, even though this is in violation of the Foreign Enlistment Act. So Canada is a hypocrite when it comes to applying the law in regards to the what Zionism is doing to the Palestinian, and which violate the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. So, fortunately, now with the media available, social media availability, the photographs that come in, the Canadian public is aware now of the magnitude of the massacres, the segregation, the apartheid, the destruction that is taking place by Zionist Israel. And our politicians still stand firmly, and the mainstream media still stand firmly with Israel. But they are feeling the pressure. And that's why now they are resorting to trying to suppress freedom of expression in Canada. So not only that they are violating their own laws and international law, but they are now trying to change, to suppress freedom of expression of academics, of students, of anybody who exposes Israeli apartheid crimes, its genocide, and what our government is doing in support of this supremacist racist entity. However, they are under pressure. And that's what happened in South Africa. It took a long time. It took a long time from the 60s till the 90s, until 93, before apartheid was dismantled, under pressure from the Canadian public and the Western public. And I think this is now where we are. We are at that stage where pressure through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, calling for the end of apartheid, the end of occupation, and the return of the refugees. Our governments can and should be pressured finally to stop supporting this racist, genocidal apartheid system. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Khaled. And thank you so much to all of the panelists and to the audience for your engagement as well as we've gone through. I think in terms of questions, we have certainly clearly heard the continual and continued exile and ethnic cleansing is made possible through the support by Israel's colonial allies. And this is not only provided but mainly provides Israel with that impunity, but also through our support, be it Canada or other countries, through military, financial, and political backing. And so certainly today's conversation around the importance of having the focus remain on the root causes of forced displacement and transfer, and inalienable right of return, and legal and practical measures and steps to ensure fulfillment of that right has been so important, and all four of you have spoken so strongly to that. As a question, I think to start, just to pick up on the theme from many of the questions that have been asked, what is most required from civil society at this particular juncture, at this particular moment? And I'll just throw that open to all of the four of you to put forward your ideas of what you feel those that are on the call and others in civil society can do in this moment that's going to be of most importance.
I would like to say that the most important thing we have to do now is to expose the hypocrisy and the double standard of our government in Canada, first of all, in the case of Canada. Because really, it not only expose it, but show that how the governments and the mainstream media are undermining the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They are undermining Canadian laws. They are undermining international law, like the International Court of Justice decision, which said the occupation is illegal. Canada's reaction or response so far has been very, very, neutral in a way. So we have to expose that these institutions which are in power are really threatening Canadian society. They are also threatening the freedom of speech, people being arrested. There was a journalist, a lawyer in Niagara Falls. She was, she was approached by the RCMP, questions, threatened with arrest because she had posted something on social media exposing and condemning Israeli genocide and mistreatment of Palestinians. So this is a threat to all the progress that was made, in the last 50 years, since the immigration system was changed to allow people based on the point system. Now you see voices coming out amongst politicians like the Conservative Party and some of the mainstream media, calling for deporting people from Canada who support the right of the Palestinians for freedom and self-determination and equality. So they are threatening really all the progress made since 1967. So this is a serious threat to every Canadian.
I would also go ahead and add that there has never been a situation in which states have on their own decided, okay, we're going to adhere to international law and human rights. It's always been a situation in which civil society has to create pressure on those states to fulfill their obligations. And this is true with regards to domestic situations, civil rights of the people that they govern, and also true when we talk about their international legal obligations. So in order to create that pressure, civil society must act in ways that disrupt the status quo and create material cost. Now, this means that business cannot go on as usual for those states. So that means there is a certain amount of courage, risk, commitment that needs to be that needs to happen with the international solidarity movement. Now, that I'm not saying that hasn't happened, because there have been people who have experienced their suppression from their own state, as Khalid has mentioned, because they have stood up for Palestine and stood up for the rights of the Palestinian people. But states are not going to come into compliance with international law on their own. There's economic, financial factors, trade agreements where they benefit from their relationship with other colonial states, including the US and Israel and France and Germany and the EU and so on and so forth. And in order to break down those benefits, there has to be enough pressure exerted by the international solidarity movement to make it no longer reasonable or feasible to continue to support a colonial apartheid regime like Israel. And so that means escalating the direct actions in ways that create this pressure. So while the international solidarity movement has been very successful through boycott, there are many businesses that are suffering from the boycott movement and from the divestment. The pressure needs to be escalated in order to get states to impose the arms embargoes and the sanctions, to break the trade agreements, to, for example, kick the Israeli ambassador out of Canada, to close down the Israeli embassy in Canada, to reverse or to end reciprocal visa privileges. This is a privilege that is granted from a bilateral agreement between states. That means that, you know, we have this diplomatic relationship where I allow your people to come to my country and you allow my people to come to your country. So these kinds of things are the things that need to happen in order for Israel to be further, the Israeli regime to be further isolated, and start the breakdown of those relationships.
If
Haider, do you want to go
Yes.
ahead and Hannah?
Yes.
And Hannah?
if I may just would like to add something, that really, to a certain extent, I believed that the slogans of human rights, freedom of speech, are really serious, especially by the Western world. But I realized that I was fooled by these expressions. These expressions and these words, I think they just meant to be addressed to the Western people and not for the human rights of others, for the right of others to speak, for the rights of others to resist, for the rights of others even to live. So what happened really is gives us that it is not just the Zionism, but it's all the Western colonialistic project is to humiliate and to oppress the whole world for their own interests and their benefits.
I could answer some of the questions. I think basically, let's not kid ourselves. The South African solidarity and boycott movement didn't liberate South Africa. It helped and it supported and it made a difference, but it didn't liberate South Africa from the apartheid regime. The struggle of the South African people that liberated South Africa. So I think, you know, it's important to emphasize that the struggle of the indigenous people of Palestine, supported by the Arab nation and the Muslim nation, that will liberate Palestine. So having said that, I'm not really downplaying the effect of solidarity and the BDS movement. I'm saying it helped, and it helped quite a bit. But what determines the demise of the imperialist power, including Canada, is the losing their exploitative tools in the whole world, from Latin America to Africa to the Middle East. If they lose these tools, it's going to reflect negatively on the societies here in Canada and in the US and the Western world in general. And this is what will be a wake-up call for the population to lobby politicians is exercise in futility. We tried that many times and we reached the conclusion they have their agenda. Not they have just their agenda, they have their interest in maintaining the imperialist society in the Western countries. So I think it's important for us to support the struggle. It's important to us to help in trying to bring down the settler colonialist identity and entity in Palestine and their imperialist backers. Because I think like for example, our BDS coalition has a main section that's calling not just for boycott of Israeli products. We're calling on boycott of all the imperialist countries that are supporting the genocide. It's in our basis of unity. Look at it and see it. So it's really, maybe Karen could put a link to our basis of unity. It's important really to boycott all these who are complicit in Israeli war crime, and we shouldn't exclude anybody, including Canada, because as I said before, they are their hands are stained with our blood through their military aid to Israel and through this special force that trying to locate Sinwar and the other hostages, and I call them prisoners rather than hostages.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to the panelists. I did just put the link into the Canadian BDS and BDS International Allies Basis of Unity for folks as well. A few years back, I did some research through several sets of archives here in Canada to understand better the period after 1967, and that would have been the period, Khaled, you were working with the newly founded at that time Canadian Arab Federation as well. And what became very evident to me was that a lot of the efforts were related to using the occupation language, both within the institutions like churches, for example, and media and the media around just losing the words around right of return and really just putting a focus on the occupation. Of course, so we would have saw that after Oslo with a different narrative around peace. And so it's so refreshing to hear this panel, that we've really got that concrete information and the history and the work that Medill and other organizations are doing that makes right of return so strong. And about 12 years ago, a church here in Canada actually passed a boycott resolution of sorts, but in that same resolution, they also negated, if they had the right to do that, the right of return by saying only if the Jewish population integrity or demographics were maintained, some language like that, which people were focused on. Oh, wow, boycott language has been introduced. But in fact, in that same resolution 194 was really discounted within that institution. So I think it's so important that we understand and equip ourselves, including those of us in solidarity with Palestinian people, around how some of this narrative works. I wonder if any of the panelists can speak to any of those sorts of ways of sort of negating that language. And I mean, at that point, it was also pushed back on some of the things we're still working on, like defunding or trying to stop selling Israeli bonds and revoking charitable status of the JNF at that time, which here we are, 50 some years later, right? Still in those conversations. So I wonder if any of the panelists might be able to speak to what we need to do in this moment as the narratives shift and change, and what we've learned from over the decades.
If I could step in here. Yeah, the language or the terminology is absolutely crucial, absolutely crucial. I mean, we've seen the way that the Israeli regime has conflated Palestinian resistance with terrorism. And we've seen how states have called Israel's genocide and aggression into Lebanon as its right to defend itself. And we've seen, for example, the colonies being referred to as settlements and the colonizers being referred to as settlers. All of this language serves to marginalize and to water down the situation in Palestine and what's really happening. I mean, we can't talk about a decolonial approach if we're not talking about colonization. We can't talk about dismantling apartheid if we're not talking about apartheid. We can't talk about the right of return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons if we're not talking about forced displacement and transfer. So we need to use the terminology. We need to say that Palestinians have the right of self-determination over all of mandatory Palestine. The Palestinian refugees and IDPs have the right to return to their places of origin and habitual residence. And as people who are experiencing colonial domination and oppression, they have the right to resist with all means, armed and non-armed resistance. And one of the things also that Hannah said, why are the Israelis called hostages and the Palestinians are called prisoners? Why is it okay for Israel to arbitrarily arrest and detain over almost 10,000 Palestinians and hold them under unbelievable situations of torture, ill treatment, neglect, abuse, and so on and so forth. And there is no call for their immediate release. But at the same time, there's a call for the immediate release of the Israelis. So there is power behind using the correct language. There is power behind identifying the root causes properly so that we can put forth the proper solutions. And so one of the things that needs to be done by the international solidarity movement and others is to actually use this language and be very conscious of the language that is being used and to use it in a proper way. So when we demand, for example, self-determination of the Palestinian people, we are not saying self-determination for those in the 1967 territory only. We are saying self-determination for Palestinians in the 1967 territory, in the 1948 territory, and all Palestinian refugees in exile and their descendants. And when we talk about the right of return, we are talking about the right of return for all Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons to their place of origin, regardless of whether that is the 1967 territory or the 1948 territory. So it's very important to use the language. And this also means that we need to be very, very clear also about the complicity of states. As Khaled said, we need to point to states and say, you are complicit because you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You support Israel with arms, you support Israel with words, you support Israel with money, you support Israel with the language that you are using and the inaccurate description or frameworks applied to the situation in Palestine.
Yeah.
I would like to add to that, like words, the misuse of words It seems, at least in the case of Canada, the misuse is directed only when they deal with the Palestinian issue. Because when it comes to Ukraine, when Russia occupied the Crimea in 2014, they were quick in denouncing it, imposing sanctions. But in the case of Israel, when it annexed Jerusalem in 1980 and the Golan in 1981, they didn't do anything, So they don't use those words properly. And then when it comes to the issue of Israel, they keep saying Israel is a Jewish and democratic country. How could you be Jewish and democratic, which is an oxymoron, they say. Imagine the reaction in Canada if Canada defines itself as Christian and democratic. Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, everybody would be upset. They would say we are out. So yet people say it all the time, politicians, media. And finally, when they talk about self-defense, a thief who steals land cannot claim self-defense, Israel was created by stealing the land of the Palestinians and denying them, and now they are ruling over 7 million Palestinians who make up 51% of the population between the river and the sea. The Palestinians are a majority. There's only 49% Jewish and 2% who are, there's 47% Jews and 2% who are not recognized as Jews. They are Christian immigrants from Europe who did not meet the requirement by the religious authorities in Israel. So the Palestinians are a majority. The majority has no voice. 51% has no voice. How could you be a democratic state? So these are things that we have to really expose when anybody speaks like that, and show them that they don't even understand our Canadian charter.
Yeah, I just follow up on what Khalid said. It's blatant hypocrisy and double standard. We've been demonstrating here against the BC liquor stores for carrying illegal Israeli settlements in there, and it's a provincial, responsibility for these BC liquor stores. They own it. They own these BC liquor stores, and they carry. Although the NDP government is in charge now in BC. Hopefully not for too long. The NDP has a resolution against products from occupied territory, and still the BC government carries the Israeli liquor wine in the BC liquor stores. We've been campaigning for 17 years, even before the NDP government, to take them off the shelf because it's illegal. It's against for Geneva Convention, against all laws, But they won't. They still are on the BC shelves in their BC liquor stores. When Russia entered Ukraine, 2 days after, the BC government took down all the Russian liquor, including the vodka.
Oh.
In 2 days, before they told us, oh, it's a consumer choice, we can't intervene. It's a consumer choice when it comes to Israeli products, but it's not a consumer choice when it comes, the same Abiy, the premier of BC, told us that it is consumer choice. He's still in power till now, while it shows the hypocrisy. Again, it shows the hypocrisy, they use the also language to intimidate us, and we shouldn't shy away from language. I agree with Lubna when you say we have the right to armed struggle. We do. We say it publicly. We don't shy away from offending sensitive Canadian or liberal Zionist or anybody else. We say we support it. The same what happened just last week. I just give me a minute or two to explain. What happened last week in our demonstration last Saturday, someone from the organizer came out after, explaining the role of Canada and the US and Israel in the genocide. The young people get motivated. I won't say the same thing. I say it in different way, because I said they go to the dustbin of history. They're gonna, go to hell. But these young demonstrators, they were so enthused. They burned the Canadian flag and they said, "Death to Israel, death to the US, death to Canada." It made the House of Commons, how dare they say death to Canada? We are saying death to the Canadian settler colonialist system. When they say death to Canada, that's what they mean. They are part of the Canadian people. They are part, the indigenous people is part of it. So as I said, I won't use the same words, but they used it and it's correct to use it. And we should support them for using it, not to get, so liberal and intimidated by the House of Commons, because it said the House of Commons and the media campaign was intimidating to everyone, including professors and everybody, and restaurants. They try to disassociate from saying that. I say it here on this webinar: death to Canada as a settler colonialist state. I won't say it publicly. I won't use the same term, but I would say it because that, just to give you some background about this House of Commons, which is really, it's, I can't find the word to describe it, but not pleasant words. But I just remind you that the Canadian House of Commons on November 12th, 1975, unanimously condemned the November 10th, 1975 UN Assembly resolution that determined that, quote, Zionism is a form of racism.
Oh.
They unanimously condemned that. And some years later, the horrific massacre of Palestinian civilians at Sabra and Shatila refugee camp in Beirut in September 1982 could not elicit the same unanimous expression of support from the House of Commons. Imagine, see, look at the double standard and hypocrisy of this House of Commons and the so-called representative of the Canadian people there. So, don't shy away or get intimidated by these MPs. They are really a rag of trash. That's what they are.
As we thank you, Hannah, just as we're ready to get wrapping up, because we're just approaching 2:30, I will just ask if any of the panelists have any final words, just in a moment or a minute or so, to highlight that we haven't been able to so far cover.
I would just add that it is our duty, I think, as civil society, Palestinian civil society, to resist. And it is the duty of international civil society to act in solidarity with that resistance. And it is only through the imposition of the public will of the people that we will get states to fall in line with their obligations under international law. So we must be the ones that impose the pressure. We must be the ones that bring about the change, because it's not going to happen on its own. And the legal mechanisms, whether it's the ICJ, the ICC, UN resolutions, all of these mechanisms that have been put in place, they are only as strong as the political will that is available to use them. So with regards to Russia, for example, they were activated and used immediately. But for Palestinians, they have been completely neglected and ignored for over 76 years. And so this is why it is our role and our duty to impose on states the pressure by disrupting the status quo, by escalating direct actions, by continuing our resistance in order to force them into their obligations of international law. And that's how it happened for former apartheid South Africa, and that's how it's going to happen for the Palestinian people.
Thank you so much, Lubna, and thank you so much to all of the panelists and to the audience that have been with us. The live stream is available already, so I put that link in. And for those that have registered, we will be providing some of the details from within the chat, both links and answered questions. And we'll post those also on a webpage, probably on the Canadian BDS Coalition and other member group websites as well, and social media. So thank you, everyone, and may we stand in support resistance of the resistance, be that resistance BDS or be that resistance for those on the ground in Palestine until liberation is realized. We will be liberated by Palestine when Palestine is liberated, all of us. So thank you, everyone, for today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
evening to those.
Haidar, bye.